Artificial Frontier Podcast.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're tackling Stonehenge.
Yeah, Stonehenge.
And oh boy, it's a big one. It is a really big one. We've got articles, we've got a YouTube video, even some archival images to dig into.
Oh, wow.
And all of them are saying, look, there's more to this monument than just what you see.
Yeah, Stonehenge is one of those places everyone thinks they know, but there's a lot of layers.
What if I told you that a lot of what we think we know about Stonehenge might be completely wrong?
That's a great place to start because we've got some evidence here suggesting that Stonehenge has had a lot more reconstruction, a lot more restoration, especially in the 20th century, than people realize.
So more of a makeover than just an ancient wonder.
Huh.
All right, so...
A little bit, yeah.
So some of these sources I'm looking at are actually claiming that Stonehenge was practically rebuilt in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And there's that YouTube video where the speaker is really insistent that it was all done to make Stonehenge seem younger than it really is. He's pointing to the erosion patterns on the stones as like the big proof.
Yeah, and that's such a fascinating point because then it brings up this whole question of what is authentic when it comes to a site like this.
Yeah.
If the stones themselves have wear and tear that doesn't match up with how old we think they are, what does that mean?
Okay, so are we saying Stonehenge is fake?
No, not fake. But the truth is there was a lot of restoration work done between 1901 and 1964. The sources we have from English Heritage are very clear that it wasn't a complete rebuild.
Okay.
It was more like a series of makeovers.
Okay, so not fake, but definitely not untouched.
Not untouched.
By modern hands. I'm curious, was that a common thing back then, restoring these old monuments?
It was. And it was controversial even back then. The very first restoration at Stonehenge back in 1901 caused a big stir. Apparently, visitors were chipping away at the stones for souvenirs, and it was making some of them unstable.
Oh, so they were taking little pieces of Stonehenge home with them.
Yeah, they were taking little pieces.
I mean, I kind of get it. It's Stonehenge, but...
Stonehenge, but...
You can't.
But yeah, not a good idea.
Yeah, so that's not good.
And there were people writing letters to the Times, quoting John Ruskin, the art critic, who famously said, "Restoration is a lie."
Restoration is a lie.
Yeah, he was very much of the romantic school of thought, where ruins are beautiful because of their decay, because of the way time has touched them. He thought that any human intervention was basically faking history, making up a false narrative of the past.
Wow. So even over a century ago, they were already having this debate about preserving history versus, altering it. So what did they do about the unstable stones?
Well, an archaeologist named William Gowland, he oversaw this project of straightening and setting one of the big sarsen stones in concrete in the middle of Stonehenge.
I mean, it gets the job done.
Yeah.
So that was the first intervention. But it sounds like there were a lot more. I'm seeing here in the sources something about a massive crane in the 1950s.
Yes, in 1958, they brought in this 60-ton crane to lift a fallen lintel back into place. Wow. And it was a very meticulously documented process. They actually screened the whole area with timber to protect the ground during the whole operation.
That's incredible. I mean, I'm picturing this stark contrast of this modern machinery against these ancient stones. Was this like a big public thing?
It was documented. They took pictures. It was even reported in the newspapers.
Okay.
But here's where it gets interesting. The full extent of what they were doing wasn't included in the information given to visitors.
Wait, so they were doing all this work, but not really telling anyone about it. Why?
That gets into this concept of historical cleansing, which basically means presenting a site as more ancient than it really is by playing down or just completely omitting the human involvement.
So were they trying to, protect the mystery of Stonehenge, keep the tourists coming?
Maybe. I mean, to really understand why they did it, we need to look at the historical context of the time. Remember, this was the early and mid-20th century, a time of a lot of nationalism in many parts of the world,
right,
and places like Stonehenge. They became very powerful symbols of national identity.
So it wasn't just about aesthetics or tourism. It was maybe about national pride and the stories we tell about our own past.
Exactly. But then that raises another question. If they were so concerned about historical purity, why even do the restorations in the first place? Why not let nature take its course?
Right, because that seems to be the opposite of keeping things pure.
Yeah, and that's where this tension between preservation and authenticity comes in. Even back then, they were wrestling with the idea that they had to protect these fragile pieces of the past, but also recognizing that by doing that, they were altering them.
So it's a real dilemma. You want to save these incredible monuments for future generations, but are you messing with their authenticity by doing that?
Right.
I'm starting to see why this is such a tricky subject. But what about the people who actually went to Stonehenge during that time? Did they have any clue about the restorations that were going on?
That's the thing. Our sources show that they very deliberately left out the details of the restorations in the guidebooks and the official information they gave to tourists. It's almost like they were trying to create a very specific story, one that focused on the mystery of Stonehenge and left out the modern stuff.
So they were shaping the visitor's experience in a way, controlling the narrative.
In a way, they were. And that raises some interesting questions about how much they were manipulating people's understanding of the site.
Did anybody speak up about this at the time?
There wasn't a huge public outcry because most people just didn't know the extent of the work. But as we'll see later on, there were some dissenting voices even back then. The argument about restoration versus preservation was happening. It just wasn't always out in the open. And remember, this was long before the internet and social media, so information didn't travel nearly as fast.
Yeah, good point. Makes you think about how this deliberate lack of information might have changed the way people thought about Stonehenge. Were they getting the whole picture? Or was it just this very carefully curated version of the past?
Yeah, that's definitely something to think about. And as we dig into the specifics of the restoration work and what was behind it, I think you'll see that the line between preservation and what some might call historical manipulation gets really blurry.
Oh, I'm ready to get into it. This is making me question everything I thought I knew about Stonehenge. But before we go too deep into the specifics, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture here. What were the attitudes towards history and archaeology during this period? How did those attitudes affect what happened at Stonehenge?
Yeah, that's an important point. We need to understand that historical context to really grasp how complicated these restorations were. The early 20th century was a time of massive change in archaeology. To understand those decisions, we really have to look at what was going on in the world of archaeology in the early 1900s.
Okay, so set the scene for us. What was happening in archaeology back then? Was this idea of restoring ancient sites a common thing?
It was becoming more common, but it was also causing a lot of debate. Archaeology was shifting from this treasure hunting adventure to something more scientific. There was this new focus on careful documentation, on digging in layers to understand the different periods of a site.
Okay, so less Indiana Jones and more like lab coats and note-taking.
Exactly. And with that shift came new questions about what archaeologists should be doing. Should they just uncover the past or should they be actively trying to save it?
Right, because I'm thinking back to that quote, restoration is a lie. Was that idea still popular in the early 20th century?
Yeah, it was still very much alive. So you had these two main schools of thought. Some people said leave the ruins alone, let them be touched by time. Others said, no, we need to actively preserve them, even reconstruct them to stop them from falling apart and to help the public understand them better.
So it wasn't just about preserving stones. It was about how you present history to people.
Exactly. And that brings us back to Stonehenge and this idea of historical cleansing. Was it just about making the site look prettier, or was there something deeper going on? Was it tied to these changing ideas about how to show the past?
Okay, I'm starting to see how all this fits together. They're restoring Stonehenge, partly to save it, partly to make it look nice. But they're not exactly advertising it. And this is happening when nationalism is on the rise and ancient monuments are symbols of national pride.
Yeah.
It almost feels like they were crafting a specific narrative, a story that fit a certain agenda.
You're right. The narrative we build around these sites is really important. It shapes how we see them, how much we value them, and how we understand our place in history.
But is it wrong to do that? Every museum exhibit, every history book is telling a story, right? We can't just throw a bunch of facts and artifacts at people. There has to be some kind of story to make sense of it all.
Absolutely. Storytelling is key to understanding history. But we have to be aware of the choices we make when we tell that story. What are we highlighting? What are we leaving out? Whose perspective are we presenting?
Okay, so with Stonehenge, it sounds like they were choosing to focus on the ancient mystery, the grandness of it all, and downplaying the modern work that had been done.
And that makes you ask, why? Was it just to make the visitor experience better, or was there a deeper reason? Were they deliberately trying to create a certain image of Stonehenge, one that fit with this idea of national pride and an untouched past?
I'm also curious about something you mentioned earlier, those dissenting voices.
Yeah.
Were there people back then who spoke out against this idea of historical cleansing at Stonehenge?
There were, although they weren't always the loudest voices. For example, in the 1950s, some archaeologists and historians were worried about them using concrete in the restoration. They said it was messing with the authenticity of the monument.
So even then there were arguments about the best way to preserve these sites where restoration crosses the line into alteration. It's interesting how those debates are still going on today. But did those dissenting voices have any influence? Did they change how Stonehenge was presented to the public?
That's a good question, and it gets to the heart of who had the power. Back then, experts had a lot of authority, and what they said about history was often accepted as fact. It was hard to challenge them, especially when their ideas were tied up with national pride and this romanticized view of the past.
So the people who disagreed with what was happening at Stonehenge were really going against the tide. Did their opinions even reach the public?
To some extent, yes. Their concerns might have been published in academic journals or talked about at conferences, but they didn't always reach the average person. And even when they did, they were often overshadowed by the main narrative.
That's fascinating. It makes you realize how much control they had over the information people were getting. It also shows how important it is to look for different perspectives, even if they're harder to find. We can't just take the official story at face value. We need to dig deeper, ask questions, and think about other interpretations.
You're absolutely right. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're peeling back the layers, looking at the complexities, and challenging what we think we know about these famous historical sites.
So what does all this mean for Stonehenge? Is it less authentic because of the restorations? Is it more of a modern creation than we realized?
That's something each visitor has to decide for themselves. But the key is to understand the full context, the work that's been done, the reasons behind it, and then figure out how that affects your own view of the site.
You know, it reminds me of something you talked about earlier, this shift in archaeology towards a more scientific approach. Did that have any impact on the way they restored Stonehenge?
It did, and it's kind of a paradox. On one hand, this focus on being scientific led to more careful documentation of the restorations and better preservation techniques. But on the other hand, it also led to a more hands-on approach. Archaeologists felt like they had the power and maybe even the duty to use their knowledge to protect and improve these sites.
So this scientific approach, which was good in many ways, also had a downside. It's like they were trying to control history to impose order on something that's inherently messy and unpredictable.
That's a very sharp observation. And it shows how our attempts to understand and manage the past can sometimes be a bit arrogant.
This is all so thought-provoking. I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
And that's the beauty of history. There's always more to uncover, more layers to peel back.
But before we get lost in those layers, let's bring this back to our listener for a moment. We've been discussing historical cleansing, changing views on restoration, and the power of narratives. Why should someone who's just fascinated by Stonehenge care about all this?
I think it matters because it encourages us to think more critically, to be more careful about how we consume history. When we visit a site like Stonehenge, we're not just looking at stones, we're experiencing a story. And that story has been shaped by choices, interpretations, even things left out. By understanding those choices, we can engage with the past in a more informed and meaningful way.
So it's not just about what we see, but how we see it. The lens we use to view history is as important as the history itself.
Exactly. And sometimes changing that lens can reveal totally new perspectives, new insights, new questions.
Speaking of new questions, I have one that's been bugging me. If this historical cleansing was happening at Stonehenge, was it happening at other sites too? Was this a widespread thing?
That's an excellent question. And to answer it, we have to widen our scope. We need to look at other historical sites, other restoration projects, and see if we can spot similar patterns.
Well, luckily, you've brought a ton of sources on just that topic.
Yeah, and it turns out Stonehenge isn't alone. Remember Avebury, that huge stone circle we talked about?
Yeah.
Well, it had major reconstruction done in the 1920s and 30s, led by this archaeologist named Alexander Keillor.
So even a stone circle, which seems so ancient, so untouched, has a modern twist to it. I'm starting to think nothing is as old as it looks.
Right. Well, Keillor's approach was fascinating. He was a big believer in what he called experimental archaeology, basically trying to recreate the building techniques that they would have used way back when to build these monuments.
So like hands-on history.
Yeah, exactly. He wanted to bring the past to life, make it something visitors could really connect with.
That's pretty cool. But I bet not everyone was happy with that approach. It seems like it could get kind of blurry, you know? Where does preservation end and speculation begin?
You're right. It definitely stirred up some controversy. Some people loved Keillor's vision. They thought he was brilliant for trying to understand the past in such a hands-on way. Others criticized him, though. They said he was distorting history by rebuilding Avebury based on his own ideas.
So this historical cleansing, this shaping of the narrative, wasn't just about leaving stuff out. It could also mean adding things in, filling the gaps with interpretations that might not be completely accurate.
Exactly. And that's where it gets really tricky. How do you know which interpretations are right, which reconstructions are justified? It's a slippery slope.
It makes me wonder about all those other famous ruins around the world. the Colosseum, the Acropolis, the pyramids. Have they been reconstructed in ways we don't even realize?
Many of them have, yeah, to different extents. Take the Colosseum, for example. It's had tons of restorations over the centuries, some bigger than others. Parts of the outer wall have been rebuilt, they've reinforced some of the seating areas, and even the arena floor has been partly reconstructed.
Wow, so even the Colosseum, this icon of ancient Rome, isn't entirely original. Seems like every historical site has this hidden layer of modern intervention.
It's not always about trying to trick people, though. In a lot of cases, these restorations are crucial to saving these fragile pieces of the past. Without them, many of these places would have crumbled away a long time ago.
But then how do you balance the need to preserve things with the desire to keep them authentic? How do you make sure these sites are protected without erasing the signs of their age, the evidence of their long history?
That's the big question. And there's no easy answer. It's a constant back and forth, a balancing act between saving the physical structure and respecting the history of the site.
This whole conversation has been eye-opening. I feel like I have a completely different understanding of not just Stonehenge, but of history in general. It's way more complicated than I used to think. It's like a puzzle with missing pieces. And we're always trying to fill in those gaps with interpretations, reconstructions, even educated guesses.
And that's what makes history so fascinating. It's a never-ending process of discovery, interpretation, and reinterpretation. There's always more to learn, more viewpoints to consider, and more stories to tell.
This deep dive has been incredible. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of Stonehenge and of history itself.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep digging into those layers of the past.
Artificial Frontier Podcast.